On a brutally cold morning in February 1944, a train carrying 183 Japanese prisoners of war rolled into the station at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The temperature had fallen to 14 degrees below zero, and frost coated every window of the passenger cars. Inside, Lieutenant Commander Tishi Yamamoto pressed his face against the frozen glass, watching the endless white landscape slide past. He had expected many things when he surrendered to American forces in the Aleutian Islands 6 months earlier. Interrogation, forced labor, perhaps even execution. But he had never imagined snow like this, stretching endlessly to the horizon. As the train lurched to a halt, Yamamoto turned to his fellow officers and whispered words that would later seem tragically ironic. "Whatever happens here, we must die with honor." What these men could not have known was that their deeply ingrained beliefs about enemy treatment, shaped by years of military indoctrination, were about to collide with a reality so unexpected that it would fundamentally change how they understood the war they had been fighting. The prisoners stepped off the train in formation, their breath forming thick clouds in the frozen air. Most wore only the tropical uniforms they had been captured in, supplemented by whatever blankets American forces had provided during their long journey across the Pacific. Yamamoto noticed that the American guards waiting on the platform carried weapons, but their expressions showed none of the hatred he had been trained to expect. Instead, they looked almost concerned as they watched the shivering prisoners descend into the harsh Wisconsin cold. "This way, gentlemen," called out Captain Robert Henderson, the camp's liaison officer. He spoke through an interpreter, a Japanese-American sergeant named Henry Tanaka. "We have warm buildings ready for you." As they passed through the camp gates, Yamamoto carefully observed everything around him. The barbed wire fences stood 12 feet high with guard towers placed every 200 yards. Machine gun emplacements were visible at key locations. This was clearly a secure facility, but something unsettled him. The guards in the towers wore heavy coats and seemed more focused on staying warm than watching the new arrivals with hostility. The prisoners were guided to a series of wooden barracks, each heated by coal-burning stoves that filled the rooms with blessed warmth. As the men gathered around the stoves, rubbing their frozen hands, American soldiers brought in heavy wool coats, thick socks, and insulated boots. Yamamoto watched the faces of his men as they received these items. Confusion was etched into every expression. In the Japanese military, they had been taught that prisoners were treated as less than human, undeserving of even the most basic care. "Why are they giving us these things?" whispered Enin Hiroshi Nakamura, a young pilot who had been shot down over a island. "What do they want from us?" "I do not know," Yamamoto replied quietly, "but accept nothing as kindness. This may be a trick meant to make us lower our guard." That evening, after the prisoners had been assigned bunks and given time to settle in, an announcement was made that dinner would be served in the mess hall. The men lined up cautiously, still unsure of what awaited them. As they entered the large dining facility, they saw American soldiers arranging serving stations with large metal containers of food. The smell that filled the air was unmistakable. Rice, but not just any rice. As Yamamoto reached the serving line, an American soldier scooped a generous portion onto his metal tray. The rice was perfectly white, each grain separate and gleaming. It was the kind of rice that in Japan only officers and wealthy civilians could afford on a regular basis. For most of his men who had grown up eating mixed grains or rice stretched with barley, this represented a luxury far beyond anything they normally experienced. The color drained from Yamamoto's face. He turned to Nakamura, who stood behind him in line, and saw the same realization forming in the young man's eyes. In Japanese culture and military tradition, condemned prisoners were traditionally given a final meal of white rice, red beans, and fish, the finest foods, before execution. The custom dated back centuries and was considered a final act of respect before death. "They are going to execute us," Nakamura whispered, his voice shaking. "This is our last meal." The murmur spread through the line like wildfire. Within minutes, every prisoner in the mess hall understood what they believed awaited them. Some men began to cry quietly. Others stood stiff and unmoving, determined to face death with the dignity expected of Japanese servicemen. A few tried to eat, forcing down mouthfuls of rice they were certain marked their final hours. Yamamoto, as the senior officer present, knew he had to maintain discipline. He stood and addressed his men in Japanese, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest. "We knew this day might come when we were captured. We will face whatever comes with courage. Eat the meal they have given us. Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing us break." The American guards and staff watched in growing confusion as the prisoners ate in near silence, many with tears streaming down their faces. Some refused to eat at all, sitting with heads bowed in what appeared to be prayer. Others ate mechanically as if enduring a final ordeal. Captain Henderson approached Sergeant Tanaka with concern. "What is happening? Why are they so upset?" Tanaka spoke quietly with several of the prisoners, then returned to Henderson with a stunned expression. "Sir, they believe you are going to execute them. They think this is their final meal before death." Henderson's jaw fell open. "What? Why would they think that?" "The white rice, sir. In Japanese tradition, condemned prisoners receive white rice as part of their final meal. They have never seen prisoners of war treated this way. They believe the white rice means they will be taken out and shot." For a moment, Henderson could not speak. Then he released a long breath and ran his hand through his hair. "My God, we need to correct this immediately." Within the hour, every officer at Camp McCoy who spoke any Japanese, along with all interpreters, was gathered in the mess hall. Henderson stood before the assembled prisoners with Tanaka at his side. "Gentlemen," Henderson began, pausing as Tanaka translated, "there has been a serious misunderstanding. You are not going to be executed. The white rice is not a final meal. This is simply what we serve at this camp. You will receive white rice at every meal, along with meat, vegetables, and bread. This is standard treatment for all prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention." The prisoners stared at him in disbelief. Yamamoto slowly rose to his feet. "You are saying we will eat like this every day?" "Yes," Henderson replied firmly through Tanaka. "Every day, 3 meals a day. The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners of war receive the same rations as our own troops. Our soldiers eat white rice, therefore you eat white rice." A Japanese lieutenant named Kenji Sato, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, raised his hand hesitantly. "In our country, we were told that prisoners held by Americans would be tortured and worked until they died. We were told that surrender meant dishonor and death." Henderson nodded slowly. "I cannot speak to what you were told. I can only show you how we actually operate. You will be treated according to international law. You will work, yes, but on fair tasks and for wages credited to your account. You will receive medical care when needed. You will be allowed to write letters home once proper channels are established. And you will eat the same food as American soldiers." The mess hall remained silent as the prisoners absorbed this information. Then slowly, Nakamura began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, then grew into something almost uncontrollable. It was the laughter of a man who had been certain he would die and had just learned he would live. Soon others joined him, the tension of the past hours breaking in waves of nervous laughter mixed with tears. Over the following days and weeks, life at Camp McCoy continued to overturn everything the prisoners had been taught to expect. They were assigned to work details, maintaining camp facilities, cutting timber in the surrounding forests, and working in the camp's agricultural programs. But they worked 8-hour days with breaks, not the brutal labor they had anticipated. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp script, which they could use to purchase items from the camp store. The camp store itself became a source of amazement. It stocked cigarettes, candy, writing supplies, and even musical instruments. Yamamoto, using his accumulated script, bought a small notebook and began keeping a detailed diary of his experiences. His early entries reveal a man struggling to reconcile his former worldview with his present reality. February 23, 1944, he wrote in careful characters, "Today we received our 3rd consecutive meal of white rice, also beef stew with carrots and potatoes. The portions are generous, no one is hungry, I do not understand this. At Rabble, our own troops ate rice mixed with whatever we could find, roots, leaves, insects when we could catch them. Here in an enemy prison camp we eat better than we did while serving our emperor. This troubles me deeply." As winter gave way to spring, the dynamics at Camp McCoy continued to change in unexpected ways. The prisoners were allowed to organize their own internal governance system, with Yamamoto elected as their representative to camp leadership. They formed educational classes, teaching one another English and various academic subjects. They created a baseball team that occasionally played against the American guards, who proved surprisingly good-natured about losing to the prisoners. Enon Nakamura, who possessed artistic talent, was given art supplies and began painting scenes from the camp and the surrounding Wisconsin countryside. His watercolors captured the strange contradiction of their situation. Enemy soldiers living in relative comfort while a brutal war raged across the Pacific. Medical care became another source of astonishment when a prisoner named Ikiro Tanaka developed appendicitis in April of 1944. He was immediately transported to the camp hospital. An American Army surgeon performed the operation, assisted by American nurses who treated Tanaka with the same professional care given to any patient. The surgery was successful, and Tanaka was given a private room for recovery, along with pain medication and careful monitoring. "They saved my life," Tanaka told Yamamoto afterward, still weak from the operation. "The doctor told me through the nurse that my appendix would have ruptured within hours. In a Japanese camp, with our limited medical supplies, I would have died. Here they operated on me as if I were one of their own wounded soldiers." Perhaps the most profound change came in how the prisoners viewed their captors on a personal level. Captain Henderson made a habit of walking through the camp regularly. He greeted prisoners by name and asked about their well-being through interpreters. He organized educational programs where prisoners could learn about American history and government. He arranged for the screening of Hollywood movies, carefully chosen to avoid themes of combat or violence, which quickly became a favorite form of entertainment. One evening in May, Henderson joined a small group of prisoners, including Yamamoto, for an informal discussion. Through Tanaka's interpretation, they spoke about their lives before the war. Henderson shared stories of growing up on a farm in Iowa, attending the state university, and working as a teacher before receiving his commission in the army. Yamamoto spoke of his career in the Japanese Navy, his wife and 2 daughters in Yokohama, and his love of poetry. "Do you miss them deeply?" Henderson asked. "Your family?" Yamamoto nodded. "Every day. I do not know if they even know I am alive. The last they heard, my ship was in the Aleutian Islands. They may believe I died there. We are working to establish a letter-writing program through neutral countries," Henderson explained. "It is complicated, but we are trying. I believe you should be able to send word to your family within the next few months." That night, Yamamoto recorded the moment in his diary. "Captain Henderson asked about my family today. He seemed genuinely concerned about my pain at being separated from them. How can I reconcile this man's kindness with what I was taught about Americans? We were told they were devils, barbarians without honor. Yet Henderson treats us with more consideration than many of our own officers showed their subordinate troops. I am beginning to understand that we were deceived about many things." As spring shifted into summer, the camp's agricultural program expanded. Prisoners worked alongside American soldiers to plant and care for large vegetable gardens. They grew tomatoes, beans, squash, and corn. The harvest supplemented the camp's food supply, and the prisoners were allowed to keep a portion for themselves. On warm evenings, they gathered outside the barracks, grilling vegetables on improvised hibachi-style cookers they had built with approval from camp authorities. Lieutenant Sato, the former schoolteacher, organized English classes that became extremely popular. Many prisoners were eager to learn the language of their captors, motivated at first by practical reasons but increasingly by genuine curiosity about American culture. "The English language is very different from Japanese," Sato explained to his students one afternoon. "It lacks the formal levels of politeness that we use. Everyone speaks more or less the same way, regardless of rank. At first, I believed this showed a lack of culture. Now I see it differently. There is a kind of equality in how they speak to one another, even between officers and enlisted men." In July of 1944, the prisoners received news that a mail system had finally been established. They would be allowed to write letters of no more than 100 words to family members. The letters would be reviewed by censors and then sent through the International Red Cross. They would take months to reach Japan if they arrived at all, but they still provided a connection to the world they had left behind. Yamamoto worked carefully on his letter for days, writing and rewriting the short message. At last he settled on simple words: "I am alive and well. I am being treated fairly. Please tell the girls I think of them every day. I hope this conflict ends soon so I can see you all again. Please take care of your health. With deepest affection, Tishi." When he submitted the letter to the censors, the American sergeant reviewing it had tears in his eyes. "This will be sent, Commander," he said through Tanaka. "I promise we will do everything we can to ensure it reaches your wife." The summer also brought an unexpected development. A group of prisoners requested permission to build a small Shinto shrine within the camp. After lengthy discussions with camp leadership and army headquarters, the request was approved. The prisoners constructed a modest wooden structure and dedicated it with proper ceremonies. American guards attended the dedication out of curiosity and respect, removing their caps in recognition of the religious significance of the event. "In all my years of service," Yamamoto told Nakamura afterward, "I never imagined I would practice my faith freely while held prisoner by the enemy. Yet here we are in the middle of Wisconsin, maintaining our traditions with the approval of our captors." As 1944 continued, news from the Pacific filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts. The prisoners learned of American advances across the islands. Each victory brought the war closer to Japan itself. The news stirred mixed emotions: pride in their comrades who continued to fight and growing anxiety for their homeland and families. In September, a new group of prisoners arrived at Camp McCoy bringing fresh perspectives. Among them was Commander Yashiro Fujita, captured after his submarine was forced to surface. Fujita was stunned by what he encountered at the camp. "This cannot be real," he told Yamamoto during their first conversation. "You are well-fed, healthy, even content. This must be an elaborate deception." Yamamoto smiled sadly. "I said the same thing when I arrived. I promise you this is simply how they treat prisoners. You will see. Give it time." Fujita's transformation followed the same path many prisoners experienced. Within weeks, his suspicion turned to confusion and then to reluctant acceptance of the reality around him. By the winter of 1944-45, Camp McCoy had become something extraordinary. The prisoners had organized a small orchestra, published a Japanese-language camp newspaper, and held athletic competitions and poetry readings. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto had become a vital link between the prisoner population and camp leadership. During a meeting in January of 1945, Henderson shared troubling news. "Commander, the reports coming from the Pacific are becoming increasingly severe. The fighting is intense, and casualties on both sides are extremely high. I know many of your men are worried about their families in Japan." Yamamoto nodded solemnly. "We hear the radio broadcasts. We know American forces are approaching our homeland. We understand what this means. I want you to understand," Henderson continued, "that no matter what happens in the Pacific, your treatment here will not change. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. That protection remains in place until the conflict ends, regardless of how it ends." As the winter months passed, the news from the Pacific grew increasingly grim. For Yamamoto, the contrast between his comfortable captivity and the suffering he knew must be occurring in Japan created deep guilt and inner conflict. "I eat white rice 3 times a day," he wrote in his diary in March of 1945. "While my countrymen fight and die, while my family endures hardships I cannot imagine. What have I become? I cannot say that I regret surviving. Is that weakness? Or is it simply being human?" Then came August. On August 6, 1945, news reached Camp McCoy of a powerful new weapon dropped on Hiroshima. At first, the details were unclear. Within days, the scale of the destruction became undeniable. On August 9, another such weapon was dropped on Nagasaki. The prisoners were devastated. Many had family living in or near those cities. Camp leadership decided to be as transparent as possible. Captain Henderson met privately with Yamamoto to express his own horror at the weapon's destructive power. "Commander, I know words are inadequate," Henderson said. "I want you to know that we will do everything possible to help you obtain information about your families. The Red Cross is working on this." On August 15, 1945, the prisoners were assembled for an important announcement. Through interpreters, they learned that Japan had agreed to end the war. Emperor Hirohito himself had addressed the nation and accepted the terms of surrender. The reaction among the prisoners was complex. Some wept openly, mourning Japan's defeat. Others felt relief that the fighting would finally end. Many experienced a confusing mixture of shame, grief, and hope. Yamamoto stood before his men and spoke with calm reflection. "Our nation has suffered a terrible defeat. Many of us have lost family members and friends. Our cities have been destroyed. This is a dark day for Japan, but we are alive, we have survived, and perhaps from this destruction something new may grow. Here in this camp we have seen that our former enemies can act with honor and humanity. Perhaps this is a lesson we should carry forward." The weeks following the surrender brought dramatic changes to Camp McCoy. The facility no longer held enemy prisoners but displaced men awaiting repatriation. Restrictions eased even further. The relationship between the former prisoners and the American staff evolved into something resembling friendship in many cases. Commander Yamamoto was scheduled to return to Japan in November of 1945. As his departure approached, Captain Henderson hosted a small farewell dinner with several prisoner leaders and American officers. "Commander," Henderson said as the evening drew to a close, "I want you to know that your dignity and leadership made this work. You helped your men adapt to a situation that must have been confusing and frightening. That required wisdom and courage." Yamamoto bowed formally. "Captain Henderson, you showed me that my enemies could be men of honor. You challenged everything I believed about Americans, about this war, and about the meaning of duty and humanity. I do not know what I will find when I return to Japan, but I will never forget my time here, or the kindness shown to us when we expected only cruelty." The train that carried Yamamoto and his group away from Camp McCoy in November traveled through the same snowy landscape they had first seen nearly 2 years earlier, but everything had changed. Yamamoto continued writing in his diary during the long journey. His final entry before sailing captured the depth of his transformation. "Tomorrow we return to Japan. I do not know what we will find there. The destruction must be immense. Rebuilding will take many years, but I am bringing something valuable home with me. The understanding that the world is far more complex than our military leaders told us. I learned that enemies can show kindness, that strength can include mercy, that honor exists in many forms. Most importantly, I learned that I was wrong to believe death was preferable to surrender. Life gave me time to think, to learn, and to grow. When Yamamoto's ship docked in Yokohama harbor in early December, he found a city transformed by destruction. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, yet life was already beginning to return. The Japanese spirit of resilience was clearly at work. Yamamoto walked to the place where his family had lived. The building was damaged but still standing. When he knocked on the door, his wife, Ko, answered. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, unable to believe it was real. Then she was in his arms and both were crying. His daughters, now 9 and 12 years old, stood back shyly at first. They barely remembered their father. But as the days passed, they slowly came to know one another again. Ko told him about the hardships they had endured. She had received only one of his letters from Camp McCoy. That single message had given her hope at the moment she needed it most. Now, as she listened to his stories about the camp, she struggled to believe what he was telling her. White rice every day, she said in disbelief, while we were eating rice mixed with sawdust and counting ourselves fortunate to have it. Tishi, how is this possible? I know, he replied. The guilt of eating well while you suffered was almost unbearable. But Ko, I learned things there that I believe can help Japan now. The Americans are not the demons we were told they were. In the years that followed, Yamamoto became involved in Japan's reconstruction efforts. His understanding of American culture, gained during his time at Camp McCoy, proved valuable as Japan navigated its new relationship with its former enemy. He maintained correspondence with Captain Henderson for many years. In one letter written in 1952, Henderson reflected on their shared past. I often think about that first dinner at Camp McCoy, when your men believed the white rice meant they were about to be executed. In a way, that moment contained everything about the misunderstandings that made the conflict possible. Yamamoto shared his story with many people, especially young Japanese trying to understand their nation's past and future. He consistently emphasized the danger of dehumanizing an enemy and the importance of questioning what one is told. Enin Nakamura went on to become a well-known artist in Japan. His paintings from Camp McCoy were eventually displayed in exhibitions. One painting, titled The First Meal, showed prisoners staring down at trays of white rice, their faces marked by fear and resignation. Lieutenant Sato returned to education. He became a professor of English and American studies, using his experiences to teach students about cross-cultural understanding. Camp McCoy itself continued to operate as a military installation. In later years, a museum was established documenting the camp's history. Among its exhibits is a replica of a mess hall from 1944, with a display explaining the white rice incident. The story of the Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy illustrates the deep human capacity for both cruelty and kindness. It shows the power of preconceptions to shape perception, and it demonstrates the possibility of transformation, even in the midst of conflict. In 1985, several former prisoners, including Commander Yamamoto, returned to Wisconsin. They were joined by American guards and staff, including Captain Henderson, now retired. Yamamoto delivered a speech that moved many to tears. When we first saw white rice in the mess hall, he said in fluent English, we believed it was our final meal before execution. That misunderstanding taught me more about the nature of conflict than any battle ever could. We had been taught that our enemies were inhuman. Instead, we found men who followed laws, who showed mercy, and who saw us as human beings. What makes this story especially powerful is how a simple meal became a lens for understanding much larger issues. For the Japanese prisoners, the white rice represented everything they feared. The reality overturned their worldview in a way no propaganda ever could. The transformation took weeks and months of accumulated experience. Each meal of white rice, each act of basic decency, and each moment of fair treatment added evidence that could not be ignored. This gradual change reveals an important truth about how deeply held beliefs are altered. When people are confronted day after day with evidence that contradicts their expectations, those beliefs begin to shift. The story also underscores the importance of how we treat those who are in our power. By treating prisoners humanely and following the Geneva Convention, American personnel created conditions where former enemies could begin to see one another as human beings. The white rice incident has since become a touchstone in discussions of cultural misunderstanding. It is taught in training programs and examined in peace studies courses. In 21st-century Japan, Commander Yamamoto's diary has been published and is now considered a classic. His honest reflections on his changing perceptions continue to resonate with readers decades later. And that brings our story to a close. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you the most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II.